I want to take you back now to 1953. A huge tidal surge caused the North Sea to engulf our coast. Kings Lynn and Great Yarmouth were flooded. The tide breached the seawall at Jaywick and sea defences at Canvey Island were completely overwhelmed. It's been called this country's worst natural disaster, and it's claimed the lives of more than 100 people in this region. 70 years on, could it happen again? And would our sea defences cope? Sean Peel reports.
(1953), on that bitterly cold January night, thousands of people went to their beds blissfully unaware of what catastrophic dark forces were stirring. It was the perfect storm, and it took perfect lives. More than 100 people died, and 25,000 homes were destroyed, some swallowed whole by a freak of nature in the dead of night.
Well, I think it was very unusual circumstances. Big northerly winds, a full moon that brought the water up, super low air pressure that brought it up another couple of feet, and really rather poorly defended coast. The seawalls were in poor quality at that point.
These defences date back to the 1980s.
What happened that night changed our thinking on sea defences. This is the seawall at Canvey Island. According to the Environment Agency, it's good for another 50 years. It's high enough, they think. But work has begun this month, costing £75 million to make it wider.
53 was a real wake-up call, especially to Canvey Island, to show how vulnerable our communities can be, and a huge investment's been undertaken in Canvey, not only in the defences, but also in our flood forecasting and our flood warning capability. And we can give communities such as Canvey in excess of 12 hours warning now if flooding were to occur.
Look at this amazing mural on the sea wall. Under the weight of the tide, the old wall gave way, causing Canvey to flood. Eventually, the floodwaters stopped rising. Many residents survived with some amazing stories to tell. And residents had to leave the island for makeshift accommodation in mainland schools. People rescued that night were taken to nearby King John's School at Benfleet. One of them was 11-year-old Ray Howard, who went on to become a councillor on the island for more than 50 years. They call him Mr. Canvey. The then headmaster of the school, Bert Evans, turned the hall into a reception centre for refugees, and they slept in the classrooms. So, Ray, look at this. This is the school logbook from the time, kept by the then headmaster Bert Evans, and he says this is February the 1st. The school was opened as a rest centre for Canvey Island evacuees. 1,500 came through the school, and about 800 slept here.
And I was one of them. And to be quite blunt, I remember it only too clearly. You know, it was so grateful to have an upstairs, because those poor souls that perished weren't privileged to have that, and they just perished in the cold and bitter weather it was, and the water was up to the top of their roofs in many cases. It was something completely unique and something that I think of often, but it must never happen again.
Back in 1963, 10 years after the floods, this BBC reporter, showing off the sea defences, clearly had no idea how quickly things would change.
The sea wall has been raised 3 feet above the top level of the freak tide of 53. But it's a fact that the table of the sea is rising about 9 inches every 100 years, owing to the melting of the polar ice caps. So about 300 years from now, somebody will have to think again.
300 years. That was a bit optimistic. The pace of climate change means we're having to think again all the time. But the Environment Agency says for now, and at least until 2070, we're safe as houses.
We're joined by meteorologist and weather presenter Dan Holley. I'm just wondering what your forecast might have been on the night before those floods.
Yeah, well, it would probably feature a fairly deep area of low pressure just passing to the north of Scotland. You can see the track on this graphic here. It started just south of Iceland, tracked across the north of Scotland, where we saw winds over 100 miles an hour, and then ran its way down the North Sea. And the crucial thing is, on the backside of that area of low pressure, we saw these very strong north-northwesterly winds really piling that water down the North Sea.
And as we saw in Sean's report then, a real combination of different factors. I mean, could it happen again?
Quite possibly. I wouldn't rule it out. I mean, the weather setup could happen again. We saw a very similar setup actually in early December 2013. Parts of North Norfolk during that event actually recorded water levels that were higher than during the 1953 event. But bear in mind, a lot of things have changed since then. Forecasting's come a long way. We've got better communications with people that are at risk. That was one of the big issues in 53, was the fact that a lot of the communication lines went down and they couldn't get the warnings out further down the coast. And also, of course, sea defences have improved a lot since the 50s. So all of those factors coming together now, I'm hoping if we did get a repeat of the weather, that the impacts would be somewhat lesser and more lives saved.
Well, Steve Morphew, that's interesting, isn't it? I mean, coastal defences and what we have now, obviously, so much better. But do you feel enough money is going into them?
No, and I think we need to rethink it rather fundamentally, actually, because we've now got the impact of climate change, and we know that things aren't the way they were in the past and that they're not going to get any better. Some of the areas around Norfolk which are being sacrificed over a period of time, I don't think we're managing those terribly well. I don't think we're defending those areas that we decide that we want to defend. I think all of that needs to be reviewed. And I also think we need to look at the defences that we're putting in and what the impact is in terms of moving the problem further around the coast. So I think it's time that we had a full look at it. In terms of the more internal areas, the Strategic Flood Alliance has done a brilliant job, and certainly General Dannett has done a great job looking at that, and the Scrutiny Committee of the County Council looked at that recently, and the bringing together of the disparate, because there's 36 different organisations that are responsible for managing flooding, but bringing those together. But it needs a huge amount more money, and it also needs a different legal setup.
And a rethink. So those are Steve Morphew's points. Do you agree with those, Peter Bone?
Well, I know a little bit about Canvey Island and the terrible flood. I was only a few months old when it happened, but my father, William Bone, in the mid-60s was the chief technical officer for Benfleet, and then went on to be Castle Point, which covered Canvey Island. And I know that politicians of all political parties have worked very, very hard to ensure that Canvey's defences are sound, and I think they still are. But where I would agree is that we should continually monitor this. And this is not one of these things that are optional. If it looks that the climate change requires more money to be put into flood defences, then it has to be done. And the government invested, I think, 2.6 billion last year in it. So I think Canvey Island is safe, but we should always be on guard. It's one of those things. It's not party political. It should be done and needs to be done when it needs to be done.
Okay. Dan, is it? I mean, I tend to sort of pick up when I listen to your forecast. Are you finding yourself reporting more and more on extreme weather now?
I think it's a combination of two things. We certainly are seeing some extremes. Last summer, for example, that heat wave, there were studies done after the heat wave that suggested that actually human-induced global warming has increased the chances of hitting 40 degrees, but also maybe a bit more awareness. Social media, 24/7 news channels also making you aware. So a combination of both. It's all about trends. If it's becoming more or less frequent, then that may well be a sign of climate change.
And a quick heads up, what's the weather looking like next week?
Less cold. I'm sure many of us will be glad to not have to put the heating on so much.
There you are. Thanks to all my guests. You've got a bonus weather forecast there as well as political discussion. Lucky you. I hope you can join us next week. We've got a special debate programme on the Cambridge congestion charge. See you then.